let's do some of this Prisma Visions Tarot deck. Since I have it in the title, I feel obligated. So, this is the Prisma Visions Tarot deck box. It has a really nice box that it comes with. And it comes with like a guidebook too. And like I was saying at the beginning, like the really cool thing about this deck is like the suits. They have like their picture on them, but like if you put them all side by side, then like the whole suit has like a larger picture. So like the wands all make a whole picture, right? So it's kind of a really cool like conceptual idea of a deck, because each piece is like a part of a greater whole, right? Which is what the whole deck really is, but like each energy kind of feeds into the next, and they're all a part of the cycle, right? So these decks are kind of fancy, like they have like these like silver like gild on the edge, and the back's really nice too. Just the eye. They're very shiny cards. And I haven't done any readings with this deck, but I don't know if I feel connected to it in a reading manner. I feel like a lot of the art on it's like super abstract. So it's not like straightforward, maybe. If you're like more of a beginner person looking at this deck, I wouldn't say it's a beginner kind of deck. It does seem to be based on like the Rider-Waite system, since it has like strength at 8 and justice at 11, but none of the art really looks the same in any sort of way, so I wouldn't consider it a Rider-Waite clone just based on the same system. So let's start going through it. First up's the Fool. The Fool's like really interesting in this deck because it's just like a pelican standing on a dock, right? The thing that strikes me as interesting in it is it's looks to be set at like nighttime, when the Fool's usually like a daytime card. And I was talking about this a bit earlier, but then we had a lot of readings come in, so. But the interesting thing is like the Fool's always like a daytime card, right? Because it's a card that's usually signified with like air and like movement, right? So it's interesting that this card depicts it at night. Granted, all of these cards are fairly dark, so it may not be like night, but it just seemed like the scenery in the back with the moon would indicate that. Next is the Magician. I think the Magician looks really cool in this. It has like that really like it's like a New Orleans vibe almost, like a real like South vibe. I don't know why I'm getting that, but I really like this Magician. He's very non-standard. Like he doesn't have his tools on a table in front of him at all. There's no depiction of the table or the other suits. It's just a guy standing in front of like a full moon, and it's kind of a silhouette, so it's an interesting interpretation. The High Priestess in this one's really interesting. She's also at night. That one's not as surprising because she's typically like associated with the moon pretty heavily. But she's got like a dropped apple, I think is what that is. Is that an apple? Oh my gosh. I think it's an apple, right? Oh, it's a pomegranate. That makes sense. Of course, it's a pomegranate. If you look at the Rider-Waite deck, her like clothes actually have pomegranates on it, I think, or the tapestry behind her, maybe. But it's an interesting, because you don't get like her front on, you just see her legs. That's kind of an interesting choice. I'm not really sure what that one's supposed to mean. Here's the Empress. Really kind of a subtle card. It's kind of just a lady walking in what looks to be like a field of wheat, which is interesting. The Rider-Waite depicts her in a field. Wheat makes sense since it's like a fertility, like plenty card, right? Like a birth card, right? A creation card. So it's kind of an interesting interpretation. She's not really like regal or anything though. She just seems to be like an average looking lady. The Emperor's interesting in that it doesn't depict a man in any way. Like there's no like masculine king sort of depiction. It's just like a skull. Looks like a ram skull or something. It's kind of an interesting interpretation. Not entirely sure what that one would mean. It looks very pretty though. I really like the use of color in that one. Which is a lot of this deck. I really just like the use of color in it. Hierophant looks to be like, I like this depiction. It's almost like a constellation sort of thing, but it's like, what do you call those? Like, you know, like the longhorn skulls, you know, like in Texas. It's like that, but it has like the hands going up for worship, and then it has like almost these like starry spirits kind of that it's kind of forming. Because I always like to think of like the Hierophant as like he's like another bridge card, right? Like he is the bridge between that which we as humans are told is spirituality and that which is given from like a higher cosmic conscious, right? Like he's getting the word from God and then he's telling us what God said, right? Like he's like the interpreter. So he's like the bridge between, he's like the spiritual bridge, right? He's also kind of a teacher. I feel like the Hierophant gets like labeled as just a religious card sometimes, but I don't think it's necessarily religious. I just think that connection between a higher spiritual plane and where we are in the physical world can apply to a lot of things. That just doesn't have to be necessarily religious. He can be hard to read though sometimes. I know a lot of like newer tarot readers I've helped they kind of struggle with him sometimes. Next is the Lovers. It's a really interesting depiction. It's like two people dancing, which I like. I don't know if you can really see it though. They're kind of small. The guy has like on one of those like masquerade masks, or like the Black Death like plague masks, but then she's got like her long overflowing dress, which looks really great. I think that's an interesting depiction because it's just showing two people in an intimate act who aren't necessarily like, you know, sex. They're not sexually connected. Chariot's really cool. It's just like a car with its headlights on. I like that depiction. I don't think the chariot always needs to have animals pulling it, you know? Sometimes I like depictions of a chariot that's just like a vehicle of some sort. Next is Strength. Strength's cool. It doesn't actually have a female in it, like holding open the mouth of the lion. It just has the lions, but it has several lions in it, which is kind of cool. Dude, what if they had a chariot card that was like a monster truck? What if they had a monster truck tarot? Like Gravedigger and stuff. That'd be cool. I don't know if they could do that. But you know, the cool thing, I was really into monster trucks when I was a kid, and it's the only phase of my life I've been super into like any sort of automobile, right? But I was only into it because the real appeal, let me get here. The real appeal of monster trucks is that it's like racing except with pro wrestling, right? Because each monster truck, like each truck has its own personality, right? Because they like soup them all up to be like a specific theme. And then you get to pick your favorite monster truck to try and win the tournament. It's genius. I don't know why it's not more popular, really. I guess it's just popular with little kids, really. Also, I usually just liked the big like dinosaur thing that would come out in the middle and like crush a car and breathe fire. That was the best part. There was also that WCW pay-per-view event in the 1990s where they literally had a monster truck battle. I find it hilarious. Oh yeah, that's right. It was on the roof of the arena, and it was like a sumo match with the monster trucks to push the other one off the side of the arena. Yeah, it's totally a thing. Who was it? Was it Big Show? And Hulk Hogan? And he literally like threw Big Show off the side of the arena, and then Big Show like showed up later. Yeah. Pro wrestling, everybody. I probably just lost like all my viewers with that discussion. But you know what? Monster trucks on an arena. It's freaking hilarious. That's alright, I don't really care. So I really love the Hermit in this deck. It's literally just like a stream at night with the moon shining down it. I think that's like a really lovely interpretation of it. I have a deck coming I'm super excited for in March that's like all like nature paintings for each card. And I really can't wait to review it. Like, I've been following it on Instagram for like a year. Like, this deck is so cool. But it's got this same kind of flavor that this card has, where it's like a natural depiction of something. And it's like, yes, I can get the vibe of the energy from just like the natural surrounding. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a human figure. When is the baby due, Bob? Is it like springish? March 3rd. Pisces, baby. That's pretty soon. So here's the Wheel of Fortune. This card's like really cool. It's a very unique depiction of it though. It's got a peacock here, and then there's like two tangled snakes, like a red snake and a blue snake, and they're like the snakes like confronting the peacock. I find it interesting that the snakes kind of form the wheel bit. And the peacock, I'm not sure. It looks great, which is all that really matters. Snakes. Yeah, I know. There's typically a snake on the Wheel of Fortune somewhere, but it's interesting that they put a peacock on it. Typically, you only see the peacock on, like, the Nine of Pentacles. I'm all for peacocks being in other places, though, because peacocks look great. Here's Justice. It has a snake on it, too. Interesting depiction. There's no scales, but the card is symmetrical. And there does seem to be, like, this dagger instead of having, like, the whole sword. Hanged Man's interesting. So it's like a body floating in the water with this like ring of fish underneath him. It's interesting that they're depicting like a drowning is almost a hanging in this case, like being submerged in your own subconscious is where like you're really like diving into. It's not so much hanging from a tree, you know? Because the Hanged Man's usually all about like a new perspective by being upside down, or like being in sort of a stasis where you just need to wait because you literally can't move. So maybe you should take advantage of this time where there is no movement and actually take some time to observe things. Next is Death. I think Death is really lovely in this deck. Now this one does call back to the Rider-Waite. So in the Rider-Waite, and in a lot of decks, really, the Fool is holding like a white rose, and it's like one of his defining things, right? So when you get to the Death card, typically, they're on Death's flag when he's riding on his horse, it'll have a white rose on it. The white rose usually symbolizes like some form of life, right? Like there's something blooming, right? Even though there's like death around, there's always like new life coming forth, right? Which kind of represents the whole transitional cycle nature of the card. This one is just a skeletal hand holding the rose, which is kind of neat. The black rose blooms once more. Lying is like 95% of what I do. No, not really. I'm being very honest. But I love LeBlanc. So temperance in this deck is a larger tree with its 2 cups. It doesn't necessarily have the exchange of water from like an angel or anything. Kind of an interesting depiction. Temperance is one of my favorite cards. I think I mentioned that on Thursday. I really love Temperance. This isn't my favorite depiction of it, but I like it because it's a bit different than usual. The Devil's really nice in this deck. It's another sort of like nature depiction, right? Where it's showing a forest, like an autumnal forest. It's really depicting like Karen's addictions to pumpkin spice lattes and how they're like chaining themselves to PSLs, and that they need to realize that the addiction is all their fault and that they could stop going to Starbucks at any time and you don't need your morning coffee, and people should stop using that phrase. That's what I get from that card. Because I really don't get what the craze is with morning coffee. But that's just me. That's just me being bitter about something that doesn't matter. You people need your coffee. That's all good. It's all good. I need my caffeine too. Bitter like coffee. I am bitter like coffee. That's only because I used to work at like Target and we had a Starbucks, and legit, the Starbucks in our Target was busier than the actual standalone Starbucks store down the road, and it made no sense. And there was just all these really rude people who were like super mean if they couldn't get, they had to wait in a super long line to get coffee. I don't get it. So here's the star. It's a really lovely card. It's interesting that it's like depicting like these flowers as the stars in the sky rather than just having an actual star. Kind of another nature scene one. You worked at Starbucks, Bob? I didn't know that. That must have sucked. I can only imagine working at Starbucks. That has to be like constant madness. Here's the moon. Pretty standard. I do like this one. Now, this one does riff off the Rider-Waite quite a bit because you have the 2 wolves howling, but I do like that the stream is still here, but it doesn't show just a like crustacean coming out of water. Instead, it shows this boat, almost as like this is like a stop on a journey to like look at the moon and really do some self like reflection, because that's what the moon is. All the moon is a reflection of the sun, right? Like the only reason the moon is illuminated is because there's sunlight hitting it. So like what are the things in your life? Like what are the things that you do having an impact on? You know, like what are the stuff in your subconscious, right? The choices you and actions you do every day. How are those affecting you deep down? The ways you're not necessarily so aware of. Target went from front end to Food Avenue to Starbucks. Oh, I didn't know you worked at Target, Bob. I used to work front end. I worked sales floor and grocery and toys and some electronics. I was like, no, I'm not doing any food stuff though. So the sun depiction in this deck's kind of interesting. Like it doesn't actually depict a sun anywhere in it. Instead, it's showing like this almost melting of like a plant with colors, which is kind of interesting. Like, because like if you think of the sun as like a heat source or a source of like energy and stuff, and then it's causing a melting, it's kind of almost like a darker approach to the card, which is interesting because typically this card's depicted like super vibrant and positive, but it does have its downsides. I really like Judgment in this deck. It's just an open door with this like cosmic sort of color scheme like coming in, right? So it's like it's kind of like facing the truth, right? Like opening the door and seeing what's really behind it, what's inside you. You know what's in there, but you got to open the door and see, right? You actually got to let it be. Here's the world. It's like kind of a big, swirl, right? Like with all the animals, the traditional animals that are on the world coming in. You got your lion up there, and you got your eagle, and they're all kind of like being into a vortex pattern, which is kind of intriguing because it's always circular. The world is. So it's interesting that they're like getting pulled in and almost like a whirlpool sort of thing. So, did I miss a card? I missed a card. How did this get in here? Hold up. Hold up. We missed a card. I thought we moved a bit fast there. We completely skipped the tower. I don't know how he wasn't in. I don't know how he wasn't in order. I've never used this deck. How was he at the back? The tower looks great in this deck. It's just a picture of like almost a mansion up on a cliff sort of thing. Very spooky vibe. Again with the New Orleans vibe. I know this isn't necessarily like French or like Bourbon Street or anything or French Quartery, but like it just reminds me of New Orleans. So I really like that because it's like a house on a cliff, right? Which is already a precarious situation. It could fall off at any moment. Typical tower energy, just something, the worst possible thing happening that you then got to build up back from. Why isn't this my favorite deck? I love this deck. I think this deck's awesome. I just don't know about reading with it. It doesn't vibe with me on that level to where I can pick up stuff quickly. There are some New Orleans decks, though. I would like to get one eventually. This deck also has an extra card in it. So this isn't a typical card at all, but it includes this card, which is the Winged Boar. Now, I do have several decks that'll have like an extra card or two in them, which are usually just like inclusions by the artist. So they're not cards you necessarily have to read with, but like if you wanted to use the deck in its entirety, they're ones you would include. And several decks will include one or two cards like that. Sometimes they're just like Kickstarter campaign things where it's like, hey, we reached this goal, I'll include another card with more art,